Hi, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see folks joining the call. Like Hazel, I'm also joining from the homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people in Boulder, Colorado. I am one of three co-chairs of four co-chairs of the IARPC observing team, along with Will Ambrose, Craig Treithluck, and Sally McFarlane, who are all on the call today. So every couple of years, it is our pleasure to host the chairs of the working groups from the Arctic Observing Summit, which took place last month, and get a report out from the meeting, and really to try to drive and develop the kind of dialogue that can lead to progress on the action items that get called out in the Arctic Observing Summit. So if you're new to the Arctic Observing Summit, we're going to be joined by Alice Bradley, one of the co-chairs, to help set the broader context. And then we'll be hearing from the first three working groups. We'll break for a little bit of discussion just so people can be in dialogue a little bit more instead of just listening to us all. And then we'll go back and hear from the last three working groups and have time for a little more discussion. As something I would like to hear about and listen for in this meeting is, what are those actions where we could, as a collaboration team, try to develop more partnerships and potentially think about proposal activities that might help support moving some of these actions forward. So as you're presenting, if there's anything you want to call out that you think would be a good sort of starting point for getting a group of people together to talk about proposal writing, please do. So with that, I will introduce Alice Bradley to lead us into the context for the broader discussion. Thanks, Alice.
Thanks. Hazel, do you want me to share my screen? That seems
sure. Go ahead. Yeah. Unless that is difficult, in which case I'm happy to.
Yeah, I got it. Okay, so I've been watching in the chat to see who all was able to join for part of or all of the Arctic Observing Summit, and who was not. And it looks like we have a good mix of people who were there in person, people who were there for all or some of it online, and then people who were not able to attend at all. So hi, my name is Alice Bradley. I'm a faculty at Williams College in Western Massachusetts. I was also one of the co-chairs of the Arctic Observing Summit this year. And for the first time, the Arctic Observing Summit was truly a hybrid meeting. So 2020, some of you guys may remember the rapid scramble to move the Arctic Observing Summit entirely online. This time we had the luxury of a little advance notice on the pandemic, and we're able to plan it as a hybrid meeting from the beginning. And so roughly a third of our participants were in Tromsø. The rest of our participants, either signing in for all or parts of the meeting, participated remotely from all over both the Arctic and around the world. So by the numbers, the summit spanned 3 days, though that hardly encompasses the almost a year of prep before the meeting started. There were 6 working groups this year running on 9 Zoom accounts. We had participants joining from at least 11 time zones, with about 120 in-person participants at various points during the meeting. We also had a little bit of a question mark with the registration, and that the way it was set up, people registered for ASSW and AOS sessions that were overlapping. So there were over 900 registered participants on the AOS days, though we know that they didn't all join us for the AOS sessions. So this year we had, like I said, 6 working groups. This is really where the bulk of the action happens in the Arctic Observing Summit. We had a number of great plenary sessions, some very interesting keynotes on Indigenous observing, business interests in the Arctic, health and community well-being. But the bulk of what comes out of the Arctic Observing Summit really does happen in these working groups and the breakout sessions that they run. In line with that, most of our discussion today is going to be run by chairs or early career co-chairs of the different working groups. But I want to introduce them very briefly now. So we have the Food Security Working Group, which is a continuation from a group that started in the previous summit iteration and has really been led by Indigenous participants. We have Working Group 2, which is the Regional to Global Observing Working Group. This again has continued from previous iterations out of work that's happened at the international and kind of global observing system scale for a number of years. This is where links between the Arctic Observing Summit and, say, GOOSE and the Global Climate Observing System, Global Cryosphere Watch, really happen. We have the Data Sharing Working Group, which is a pretty substantial overlap with the Arctic Data Committee. And this is kind of the Arctic Observing Summit presence of that organization. Working Group 4, which is the System Integration or ROADS process working group. This grew out of the previous design optimization and implementation working groups. We have Working Group 5, which is Utility and Benefit. That was previously the Working Group for Adaptation and Mitigation. And then our new addition this year was Working Group 6, which focused on capacity sharing as it applies across kind of all of the different areas of interest at the Arctic Observing Summit. So we had a couple of kind of new things for 2022. One obviously being that it was a hybrid meeting. We also introduced cross-cutting sessions. So every working group, in addition to kind of doing their own thing at this meeting, had sessions scheduled to work with every other working group. And so, as you can probably imagine from this list, there's quite a number of topics of interest to more than one of these different groups. And something that came out of previous Arctic Observing Summits is really the need to make sure that these conversations are happening in real time with the different groups that need to be in the room. So we planned that right into the agenda. We promoted our early career rapporteurs into early career co-chairs, giving them a little bit more responsibility and a little bit more space at the table to participate in the Arctic Observing Summit. So we'll hear from a number of our early career co-chairs today. And then we also added online evening sessions that some of the working groups ran in order to better take advantage or better kind of accommodate the time zones that we were working with and include remote participation from North America. And so some of the working groups use these times differently than others, but they were, for some groups, really useful for active discussion of people who couldn't be there in person. And so with that, I'll hand over to Craig, I believe, with Working Group 1.
Yeah,
unless anyone has any overall questions first. Sorry.
Doesn't look like it. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
I will share my screen. I believe this is the correct one. Hi, everybody. My name is Craig Treithluck. IARPC Indigenous Fellow, Food Sovereignty Working Group, Indigenous Liaison, based out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks here. That was my connection to the Arctic Observing Summit. The Food Security, then now Food Sovereignty Working Group was a direct result from recommendations that were made during AOS 2020. Some of the folks who are released earlier, who I saw in attendance of this exact meeting, were direct contributors to creating the space for the Indigenous liaisons and folks to attend these spaces. So it's very exciting to be here. I was supposed to be there in person, but ended up needing to stay awake all night here in Fairbanks and participate online, which actually worked out really, really well. Corey Erickson and Christian, I'm sorry, I'm spacing out his last name, were the other co-chairs. Both Chris and Corey were there in person. And I was then able to participate online, kind of moderate and facilitate those discussions. So it worked out really, really, really well. And I have a brief presentation, just kind of a quick summary and overview of some of the topics and discussions that we had during that time. Alice, you covered this really, really well. So I don't think we need to go over this at all. Our main theme that we focus on when we are planning and looking or planning our discussions and what we wanted to talk about in our working group 1 sessions and then our breakout sessions, we're looking at this main question or set of questions: how sustained observations can contribute to well-being and better understanding of rapid Arctic change. So we really focused on that when we were looking at the information and the short statements that each working group was sharing, and then collaborating to come up with our breakout session discussions and questions that we wanted to ask. So how we started the conversation when we first got into the AOS sessions was we had our working group 1 food security breakout session where we all met together and just kind of had discussions about some of our priorities and thoughts and kind of grounding us into why we were looking to attend this conference. And day 1, the main question that we had, well, the only question that we were able to answer in the 90 minutes on an individual and kind of regional observation or look was, we asked everybody around the room, what does food security mean to you in your region? And I think the main thought behind this is we wanted to kind of tease out some of the local to global differences in what food security might mean. And some of that did come out, but we had a lot of overlapping themes. Sovereignty, accessibility could definitely be sort of lumped into maybe one, but we had different meanings of what accessibility and sovereignty was on that North American and maybe the Scandinavian definitions of it. So that was really interesting. The different perspectives on food security between our North American and our European relatives was definitely a little bit different. But one thing that was pretty clear and universal is that Indigenous knowledge needs to be incorporated in management and decision-making bodies. That was a message that came very clearly from both the North American, Greenlandic, and Scandinavian partners that were, or participants that were there at the AOS and kind of contributing in this space. And another thing that we discussed kind of universally is looking at the researchers and what capacity building and capacity means when engaging with Indigenous community knowledge holders, is that there's a lot of information, a lot of Indigenous frameworks and Indigenous knowledge that is already available. So when I think one frustration that came from a lot of the participants is when researchers go into community, they're asking a lot of the really fundamental questions over and over and over again, like what is Indigenous knowledge? What is Indigenous sovereignty? How can we incorporate that into Arctic observing and monitoring? There's a lot of information out there, and the people who are in attendance had answered that question over and over again. So that was definitely a theme that had come up. Day 2, we looked at kind of moving forward after the discussions with our day 1 breakout sessions is what does sustaining positive impacts on local and Indigenous communities in Arctic observing look like? And these were some of the values or the themes that came out of that. Engaging with our youth, boundary spanners, and the incorporation of folks who are kind of moderating between the Indigenous communities and the research world. There's a lack of Indigenous engagement that leads to non-relevancy to the end user in the process. Relationship building and capacity sharing or building or funding Indigenous leadership and inclusion in all stages of Arctic observation, monitoring, research, planning is really, really important. So those are some of the main themes that came out of day 2 as we were reflecting on our first days of breakout session discussions. Day 1, we had our our grounding. And then we also went on to meet with working group 2, working group 3, and then we had our evening recap. Working group 2, regional to global, the main question that was looked at in that space is what are the requirements for observations to support food security from a user perspective in light of the UNDOS process. I think the main conversation that happened out of that is that it's really difficult to answer a question like that from a local or more specifically a global scale. And then the timeframes in answering that question are very, very different from an Indigenous perspective. The resolution or the not generalizing on a local scale, you kind of lose some of that once from the participants who were there mentioned that some of the specifics and details from that local need is definitely lost and generalized as we expand to a global scale. And the time differences and needs from the Indigenous community to maybe a project or a funded grant where it's only like 2 to 5 years versus the observation needs and requirements from an Indigenous perspective. Our observation needs are to ensure that we can continue to live in the Arctic as we always have done. So like the needs for observation from an Indigenous and or research perspectives were very, very different. Our data sharing, that was a really good conversation as well. We talked a lot about data sovereignty. We had a really good short statement presentation from Vanessa. And then we kind of looked at the idea of what are the highest priority data themes that need to be addressed. And we didn't get too far into that conversation because I think we were kind of getting hung up that all of the data priority themes need to be addressed. Yeah, so we had a really good conversation there. Working group 1 recap day, we had a couple of folks that we just briefly talked about what happened during the day and then signed off a little bit early. The next day we had utility benefits and the say on roads. We had a really good presentation from Turo from Arctic Snow Change. The main themes that came from that discussion or listening session really was the importance of working with community and using Indigenous knowledge to lead observations for actionable change. Those messages were loud and clear from Turo. And then Sandy gave a really good presentation on the societal benefit frameworks and the importance of getting Indigenous knowledge and different perspectives to, fine tune or evaluate what is societal benefits in this world of research, but more specifically to the sand roads process. The systems integration, Margaret gave a really, really good co-producers knowledge presentation based off her short statement and kind of looking at the practice of the methodology and using the food security, food sovereignty working group discussions and focus group meetings as a little bit of a case study. Alice Bradley, thank you for your excellent presentation on the shared Arctic variables and kind of the uniqueness of those in comparison with like the essential variables and some of the other metrics that other folks are looking at. I'll wrap it up here really quick and just kind of get to the end. I think most importantly is as we were getting towards the end of day 3, we started really honing in on what was most important. And I think a lot of it had to deal with sovereignty being a big issue, the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. It's really important to collaborate with natural sciences. And by collaborating, we really meant capacity sharing and funding Indigenous people to participate and make decisions on the process of planning, proposal writing, analysis, self-defining metrics of success. So that's kind of what we had discussions on day 3, and we finished it off with capacity building. And at this point, I think we were really, really honing in on exactly what everybody was really wanting out of these high-level academic spaces. And capacity building was a really good way to kind of express some of our thoughts, because there's so much there. One of the main topics out of here was that there's such a misalignment of what capacity means. Indigenous knowledge is an entirely different set of skills and knowledge, and Western understanding of what capacity building is and means is very different. It was definitely brought out that Indigenous knowledge and the capacity that we have in the Arctic can lead Arctic observing and monitoring, and capacity building, capacity sharing has been often viewed as checking a box and getting these very narrow engagements with Indigenous knowledge, like paying for boat drivers and for people to collect, water data and samples and stuff like that, but not actually planning and centering Indigenous knowledge to ensure that the end result has an applicable use for the Indigenous community. And from our perspective, most importantly, looking at regulatory and policy decisions. So there are definitely some misalignments in what capacity is. We had a lot of discussions about theatrics of these conferences, and moving beyond these discussions that we're having in these spaces outside of the community, that we really need to start focusing on action. And I think the most important message is that we are building off of what capacity, from our perspective, what capacity can and could look like. And we spent a little bit of time looking at the RNA's liaison team and how that is working out in creating capacity and the ability to get folks who are attending these meetings in these spaces in a boundary spanner type role to kind of bridge the gap of understanding between the Western and the community worlds. So I think that's probably the most important takeaway from that session, and partially some of the recommendations that we had overall. But I'll stop there. I think I've taken up too much time already. I didn't time my talk, so I apologize, but it was a really good conversation. We really enjoyed the event. But yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Craig. That was a great recap. And I think as we go, because there were so many cross-cutting conversations that some materials already going to have been covered and such as we move forward, but those were really useful observations. So we'll just go straight to working group 2, and then questions for Craig. We'll have a discussion period after we hear from the first 3 working groups. And so from working group 2, we're going to hear from Maureen Bierman.
Oh, you're still muted.
There. Okay. Are you guys
Perfect,
seeing
thanks.
my slides? Are you seeing my slides correctly?
Yeah, they look great.
Okay. Great. Super. Thanks. Right. So I'm presenting on behalf of Working Group 2, Regional to Global Observing. Hi, everybody. My name is Maureen Bierman. I am the project coordinator for the NSF-funded research networking activity for sustained coordinated observations of Arctic change, also known as Arctic RNA co-ops, housed primarily at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but with quite a number of other institutional partners. I want to point out that I'm presenting here as a participant in Working Group 2 and as part of institutional support at IARC for the AOS Secretariat, but I was not co-chair for Working Group 2. You should be seeing now the slide that has the 4 co-chairs listed, as well as some Secretariat support that offered assistance with them in presenting and putting together the proposal and recommendations and outcomes that I'm sharing here. Everything I'm sharing does come directly from the report compiled by the co-chairs along with the Secretariat support.
Maureen, we didn't see your slide.
You're not seeing. Okay, I don't know why that's, let me try this again. Okay, so here's the list of co-chairs: Jari Haapala, Leonard Gerke, Michael Lammers, and Toshte Tanua, along with Secretariat support from Modica Vitu and Jan Rene Larsen. So there were a number of different themes that kind of centered and grounded the discussions of Working Group 2 at AOS 2022. Specifically, there was a focus on the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And this included really thinking about the Arctic Action Plan that was formulated last year as a framework for fostering further activities and how to move forward from that Arctic Action Plan. It was discussed as an opportunity to forward sustained Arctic ocean observing, and the working group had a lot of discussions around strengthening cooperation and alignment of observing efforts globally. There is a lot of interest in exploring a unifying or umbrella kind of organization that links Arctic observing activities to the Global Ocean Observing System, or GOOS. Another theme that really centered the discussions was thinking about better coordination of defining and managing requirements for Arctic observations. There were several frameworks associated with this that defined essential variables, and this included essential climate variables, or ECVs, that describe the climate state of the planet, the essential ocean area variables, or EOVs, that have been derived from phenomena like ocean acidification. And the working group discussions focused on how these essential variables are derived and how to reduce long lists of variables to those that were really kind of essential for the processes at hand. A key aspect of this discussion also was the definition of the temporal scale of variables, since this differs obviously between local, global, and regional purposes. Locally relevant variables are often kind of noise for regional and global purposes. At the same time, there was discussion about how we can kind of really link and think through the local variables that are relevant for local communities and Indigenous communities in particular. The group discussed how the introduction of the shared Arctic variables concept relates to these existing frameworks and how it can achieve these other goals as well. A third theme that really was focused on in this AOS for Working Group 2 was thinking through the interactions across the various working groups. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that the AOS was set up with these particular cost-cutting meetings, cost-cutting sessions that were scheduled throughout the meeting. The interaction with other working groups focused on the following sort of sub-themes. With Working Group 1, the Food Security Working Group, there was a lot of discussion about how observing objectives define requirements for observations, the need, as well as the need for deeper engagement with Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge. And there was, for sure, as Craig discussed, a lot of differences and perspectives about this, about how this could happen and how this could be really relevant for both kind of the high level global scientific observation happening, as well as for Indigenous and local observation. With Working Group 3, data sharing, there was discussion of harmonization of data encoding, as well as observation practices to coordinate observation efforts. Our discussions with Working Group 4, system integration, focused on the concept of shared Arctic variables. And the question raised in this was why existing essential Arctic variables or essential variables would not suffice, and specifically how SAVs could instead add value to this kind of thinking. The SAVs have less of a focus on scientific questions, but more on needs of people and societal benefits. And that was the real addition that Working Group 2 identified in this conversation. Working Group 5, utility and benefits. Our cross-cutting session with this group focused on defining value chains, connecting observations with users. The key questions were how to turn observations into data, how to transform these to information and knowledge. There are a large number of knowledge platforms, and one aspect of this that's difficult to document is documenting uptake and impact. And also within this area, there was identified a real need for sustainability of efforts and a need to document impact in order to motivate long-term funding for these efforts. With Working Group 6, capacity sharing, the discussion was really focused on sharing capacity between experts and local Indigenous knowledge. And this particular cross-cutting theme, we really had to start out with kind of coming at it from creating a mutual understanding for capacity sharing. There's a real difference in terms of how this concept was thought of between Working Group 6 and Working Group 2. And so this sort of led to this deeper discussion about the offerings that local and Indigenous knowledge have, and how the latter may have really relevant information that's key for what's happening at a kind of a scientific expert level. And let me see, also the GeoKnowledge Hub was discussed in this cross-cutting session, and it was identified that it doesn't currently cover the Arctic, but that it would be this would be a really great opportunity to potentially expand this and develop that. I'm going to move on now to a discussion of the recommendations that emerged from Working Group 2 out of the meeting. Specifically, the AOS acknowledges the existing global networks with established standards and coordination, and recommends that these networks extend further into the Arctic, and that the Arctic observing community provides observing requirements guiding regional observation design. The multi-level polycentric nature of Arctic observing efforts requires effective learning and sharing mechanisms along the value chain of observing. The Working Group 2 recommends stronger links between local and Indigenous communities and scientists at regional to global levels to increase understanding of requirements and opportunities. The concept of shared Arctic variables provides a useful framework for the Arctic region, linking global requirements and local and regional Arctic requirements and adding value to existing and evolving essential variable formulations. The Working Group 2 recommends moving forward on the formulation of SAVs, keeping in mind existing links to global EVs and taking into account their ongoing evolution. In view of a changing Arctic, it is important to establish an effective observing system to take into account also health and change of the ecosystem in order to support food security and well-being. Working Group 2 recognizes the need to sustain observing systems long-term and recognizes that the majority of environmental observations are made in the frame of short-term science project funding. Working Group 2 recommends increasing the fraction of long-term funding for the Arctic observing systems in order to maintain time series, creating understanding for environmental change and variability. Next, Working Group 2 recommends using data centers that apply FAIR principles, linking regional observations to global data products. Recognizing the large fraction of data collected by research efforts as opposed to sustained observing systems, Working Group 2 recommends creating incentives and easing the process for scientists to share data in a timely manner, prioritizing data contributing to the sustained observing system. And lastly, AOS would like to emphasize that the ongoing UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, or UNDOS, provides a framework to harmonize Arctic ocean observing efforts, possibly leading to an Arctic Goose Regional Alliance, or GRA. And Working Group 2 recommends continued efforts to establish an Arctic GRA in the framework of UNDOS, thereby establishing effective links to the global ocean observing system. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Maureen. So we'll move forward to the Working Group 3 report out, and for that we will be hearing from Christina Miller. Thanks, Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hazel, for sharing my slides. And I'm going to keep my camera off just to conserve some bandwidth here. I'm Christina Miller, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary, and I was part of Working Group 3 as an early career co-chair this year. And I'm drawing the information that I will share today as general themes from our upcoming report from the AOS. So our working group worked with other working groups at the AOS, and also centered our individual discussions, or just within our working group, around 5 main themes. Those five main themes were sharing and listening, federated search, open science, data policy, and data ethics. Across our conversations as a working group, as well as our cross-cutting sessions, we had recurring themes that emerged. Those include the need for continued effort to coordinate and bring data systems together in an integrated Arctic observing system, and systematically enhancing the usability of scientific data. Furthermore, the need for focused effort to transform data into products that can support specific activities and applications, such as enhanced food security in communities, decision support, and realization of the shared Arctic variables, or SAVs. The need for data-related training and education resources was expressed across several sessions, as well as organizations developing the resources should work closely with users to better understand motivations, challenges, and applicability. So making data available across various users and making sure that data speak to the user needs. Sorry, Hazel, go ahead. You can advance the slide. Thank you. Furthermore, we had conversations recognizing the right of Indigenous people and nations to govern collection, ownership, and application of Indigenous data, and the appropriate application of care, fair, and trust principles. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, ethics. And TRUST stands for transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. Specifically in the context of data ethics and data rules and their parts to play in the entirety of the data lifecycle. We spent a session talking about those principles and the data lifecycle from the beginning and formulation of research questions all the way through to the end of data sharing. Many groups, including the World Meteorological Association, Arctic Data Committee, and partners, GEO, regional and national governing bodies are working together to align data policies and develop models for implementing policies and data systems. We discussed several funded research projects and national initiatives that should be leveraged to advance this work in concrete ways. And finally, our working group and those who attended the AOS saw an example of international coordination and how that has led to the launch of the Polar Federated Search Tool by the Polder Working Group. This was launched as a result of several years of effort, dedication, and collaboration that brought together international partners to achieve their shared goal. Next, I will talk a little bit about our preparation for the next AOS. Hazel, can you please advance the slides?
My apologies, my internet just cut out, so you probably lost the screen share, but I'm glad you all are still here.
If we could just move to the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So over the next couple of years, the data sharing community will continue to enhance and increase support for international collaborations through the Arctic Data Committee and its partners and task-specific working groups such as Polder. The next couple of years will focus on establishing context and interoperability of data that builds on newly interoperable metadata realized through the Federated Search Tool, which we launched at the AOS. Enabling interoperability includes compelling system owners to make existing data and services available in standardized form to user communities, enabling cost-efficient integration of data in various types of decision support systems. And finally, in order to ensure long-term sustainability and secure the content, success, and future viability of these initiatives, the data sharing community plans on developing new data education and training initiatives for early career scientists and researchers. Next slide. And finally, this is our list of action items and recommendations going forward. And those include continuing to enhance and increase support for international collaborations through Arctic Data Committee, Polder Working Group, and other efforts like that. Focusing on holistic efforts of data interoperability, continuing work on transformation of data into information that meets the needs of different end users for decision-making purposes, focusing on different communities of data users, encouraging system owners to make existing services available in standardized form to user communities, enabling cost-efficient integration of data in various types of decision support systems. Further development, alignment, and practical implementation of data policies across research and operational communities. And finally, developing new data education and training initiatives for early career scientists and researchers. That is all for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christina. So we're going to take a pause here, and maybe just to make up a little bit of time, we'll just go for 7 minutes until 10 till the hour before we start the next set of readouts. But are there questions or comments from the audience, places where even the presenters might want to ask each other questions?
I've got a question for Craig, who I see all the time, but I'll take this opportunity to ask this question now anyhow. Did you get to the stage, you said that you discussed observations to support food security. Did you drill down far enough to get to the stage where you could identify some of the observations, realizing that many would be, specific to localities, but did you come up with any essential variables that you felt were important for food security?
No, thank you. Well, that's a really good question. But the short answer is no. It's really difficult to look at an essential or even a shared Arctic variable in this academic space because it's not a community-driven space. So what we're really focused on, and I would think the discussions that came out of Working Group 4 and Working Group 5, like the recommendations there, employ equitable representation, co-production knowledge to ground roads, and the acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge and values to ensure representative benefits frameworks. Those are what we focused on in this space, just because we don't have, like all of our elders and youth to actually identify a shared Arctic variable in this space. So we spent some time discussing what that would look like. And I think a lot of the momentum actually happened after the evening session with Alice and Margaret, with the inclusion of both Eva and Harmony, where they had really good discussions on what building a shared Arctic variable and using the Stay on Roads expert and advisory panel process would look like. That was a really good space, and I didn't get a chance to attend it all, but I think that probably answers the question best, is that we focus on the process, because this is not, AOS is not an Indigenous space. It's a boundary spanner. It's an academic. It's a very Western space.
Yeah, it's definitely a Western space. So would the next step then being going to the communities, bringing some of this to the communities, and then saying, more than one community, obviously, and saying, okay, so this is what we discussed in this Western space. How do you see it, and what do you think we should do?
Yeah, thank you again. That's a perfect follow-up question. I think what we are focused on now is using the food security, food sovereignty working group liaison framework as kind of a way to move forward. We have an established, project proposal and a framework through the food security working group that is engaged with community members, or in our case, proxies as the liaison team. So how I would suggest that we move forward is we look at some of these grants and proposals on planning that we can build into the proposal, time, space, and equity, and pay Indigenous people to participate in the planning, so that when we come up with and think about the relevancy of what is a shared Arctic variable, that we get it directly from the mouths of the people in the Arctic, and we pay them very well, like as equally as at least me, maybe not everybody in this room, but to be in those spaces, to make up those decisions so that they can inform you on how, number one, what those themes are, and then the relevancy, and then the usability of that information. It needs to come from that space. So next step is get a whole bunch of people together, talk about our priorities, and then figure out a way to fund Indigenous communities, Indigenous participation, so that we can get their leadership. Because that's at least the recommendations from Working Group 1 in this space, and then the food sovereignty, food security working group. Those are our recommendations moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Craig. I trust that NSF was listening to all of that.
I was just going to say, Craig wins a prize for being the first person to talk about fundable opportunities. See if you can win second prize, somebody out there. Hayo, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Well, I had a question for Christina, actually. I see we're running a bit out of time, but Christina, I appreciated your update, including the progress on the federated search. And I noticed that you were already referencing as part of that to make sure that the data are discoverable and interoperable as well from a data user perspective outside of the research community. And I just wanted to see whether you could give us a brief perspective on what you've discussed within the group, if anything, what might be needed to better connect with groups outside of the classic research community.
Thanks for that question. I'm going to attempt to answer that, and hopefully if Chantal from our working group is still on the call, maybe she can chime in as well. That discussion spanned across several different sessions. To my recollection, we talked about data interoperability and usability of data within the research community, but also getting that out into user communities. So we had a conversation about this with Working Group 1 and some of the projects in Canadian Northern communities and some of the research taking place in Scandinavia as well, in essentially with end users, people that end up receiving the data from the science and research community. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, that's great to hear. I mean, if Chantal has anything to add, would be great to hear from her as well. But this was exactly what I was hoping for. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll hop in real quick. Christina, yeah, you nailed it. Really captured what we talked about. The one thing I would add is that we did have discussions surrounding including the private sector as well. And, really incorporating or sharing knowledge both ways with the private sector and trying to get them involved and aware of the different initiatives that are happening in the data community. So I would just add that to Christina's answer as well.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions. To keep driving the discussion forward. I know the presenters appreciate it. So let's turn now to our second set of presentations, and maybe I'll recommend that if some points have been made in cross-cutting sessions by the other working groups already, that we maybe can focus on points we maybe have heard a little bit already, or the points we haven't heard yet, and then we'll move through our next three presentations into our final discussion. Starting with Alice.
Thanks, Sandy. So jumping in with working group 4, so again, system implementation and SAN roads process. So the working group goals were really to focus on getting Arctic Observing Summit community feedback on the roads process, and then coming up with really specific guidance on how we move forward proposing and implementing shared Arctic variables. So a lot of these ideas came out of the first the paper that Sandy led on the roads process, the previous documentation, and discussions at the last Arctic Observing Summit. But at this stage, we're at the point in which, especially Arctic Passion is ready to hit the ground running on a shared Arctic variable proposal and needed really specific guidance on kind of what was expected from them. So our daytime sessions were really focused on developing guidance for shared Arctic variables in the process. Our cross-cutting sessions were more focused on feedback on the plan as it exists and as it was evolving over the course of the summit. And then, as a couple of people have mentioned, we had these evening online sessions where we ran mock expert panels. First, focusing around the theme of wildfires and what might be an interesting shared Arctic variable on that topic or related to that topic. And then the second one on Thursday evening on fisheries and food security in that context. So we had some really great conversations, a lot of really important input from Margaret and Eva Dawn and others in these discussions. And we were able to learn a lot from the process of just having the conversation in kind of a non-final draft form. our outcomes, I'm going to skip to over altogether the kind of details of the cross-cutting sessions, because I believe most of those have been covered already. So I came up with some pretty specific guidance, or at least actionable guidance for Arctic Passion and for RNA co-ops to start the process of proposing shared Arctic variables and organizing expert panels, especially given the current status of SAON is currently on pause. They needed a certain amount of marching orders in order to get the ball rolling on this process. So the mock expert panel has really made it clear how much of the roads process we're going in the approach to defining shared Arctic variables we're going to have to define as we go and really iron out wrinkles as we're in progress. I think we knew that going in, but it really puts the onus on the pilot efforts from Arctic Passion and from RNA co-ops to try this out and do the best we can, but also learn from the process. The other piece that we established during these discussions was that it's really critically important to engage relevant Indigenous experts from the very beginning. So these are important roles for boundary spanners and a really small core group of relevant experts who can then be responsible for working with the Roads Advisory Panel to build up this broader group of people who have expertise in both a particular theme area, whether that's wildfires or fisheries, but then also other areas, other application areas that might have shared interest in the kinds of observations that would go into fisheries or whatever is on the table. So this requires both culturally sensitive facilitation and a certain amount of, we're expecting a certain amount of conflict resolution within the expert panel process. And we're also expecting it to be an iterative process as we kind of build out this more comprehensive expert panel group. So where a core group starts working with the SAON Roads Advisory Panel to put together a more comprehensive set of people. And on that note, the Roads Advisory Panel is really going to play a key role in making sure that the relevant voices are included in the development of the shared Arctic variables. We're really hoping that we can get everyone, kind of the full breadth of people who need to be at the table involved before a proposal for a shared Arctic variable goes out for public and community-wide comments. So it's not going to be possible to include everyone in every discussion, but we want to make sure that we can get as broad a swath of input as we can as early as possible. We also identified some communication gaps around kind of what is a shared Arctic variable. We have some recommendations on how to convey those ideas more clearly, and that some of that came out of just having all of these cross-cutting sessions, and so being able to talk through the same concepts with 5 different groups gets a lot of practice at communicating some of these ideas. And then finally, the shared Arctic variable documentation. Not only should it include kind of what the observing requirements are, but also documentation around methods and practices to achieve that. And then that can double as opportunities for a capacity building resource, where not only can a shared Arctic variable have requirements, but can have the resources to learn how to meet them. And so with that, I'll just pull up the action items and recommendations we have moving forward. First, the kind of came up with this bigger process for pulling together, or for how expert panels first get built and then pulled together a shared Arctic variable proposal. So that needs kind of stamp of approval from the Roads Advisory Panel or any modification to moving forward. But at least for the time being, it's a draft that Arctic Passion and RNA co-ops can work from. The 2 big projects, again, RNA co-ops and Arctic Passion, can start moving forward on shared Arctic variable definitions. We think the themes that we were looking at around the mock panel, so something related to wildfires, something related to food security and fisheries, but then there are 2 other short statements related to permafrost and sea ice, are probably good candidate themes to start with, but there may be others. And then we really recommend that RNA co-ops and Arctic Passion kind of keep in touch, keep meeting, keep kind of working together on the lessons learned in this process as we build up that expertise. With the goal of having 1 or more shared Arctic variables through to the stage of kind of broader feedback before the next Arctic Observing Summit in 2024. We also identified a real need to facilitate Indigenous groups leading shared Arctic variable development. So it's one thing to have RNA co-ops being as responsive as possible to community needs, but it's an entirely different thing to have Indigenous groups actually leading the process from the get-go. So this is a recommendation towards the Roads Advisory Panel process, and thinking about how to financially support Indigenous liaisons or others in Indigenous leadership positions to be able to kind of lead this theme development and propose ideas for shared Arctic variables that are immediately or most relevant to their work. And then finally, we just had a lot of discussions, especially around the mock expert panel process that's relevant to the Roads Advisory Panel. And so we'll have write-ups of those processes and kind of what we learned, what we did. That'll go to the advisory panel over the summer. So I will hand it off now to Working Group 5.
Great, thanks, Alice. I did not make slides for today, and a lot of the material that Working Group 5 discussed happened in a lot of those cross-cutting themes. So rather than going over that all again, I'll try to draw out some themes. First, just acknowledging that I was an active participant in Working Group 5, but not formally not a part of the leadership team at all. So recognizing that those co-chairs are Mary Beth Murray, Ravi Sankar, Serjan Dobracek, and Anna Pegasanova. And they did a great job of organizing this working group. We had some really interesting short statement presentations. Actually, a fair amount of focus on engaging the private sector. And one part of that, so Working Group 5 is focused on utility and benefit. And one part of that I found interesting was being able to hear from some of the private sector folks how they do user needs analysis. So that's obviously something that's important if you're delivering a product to a customer, and something that I feel like the observing community could learn from, and is definitely linked to that sense of providing utility or providing benefit to communities. We had a presentation from a network of research stations about how they could be engaged in piloting different kinds of projects. Yeah, again, private sector looking at risk management, different kinds of data, data management. And then in the crossover section with Working Group 1, to answer Sandy's call for fundable projects, there was a discussion that I think Craig touched on briefly about developing a co-produced framework to evaluate how well observing systems are performing in the Arctic in terms of meeting the needs of communities, Indigenous communities, and sort of a wider range of actors. And so there's some of the authors of a really interesting white paper are on this call. So if you have questions about that, I'd encourage you to ask them. Let me see, other themes. Yeah, just going back to the data literacy, developing data agreements and making those really robust, and training people on how to do that was a strong theme. The need for a structured evaluation tool to evaluate how observing systems are delivering utility and benefit to a wide range of actors, stakeholders, and communities. And I already touched on that. So there are a couple of concrete actions that we discussed that I think will be reflected in the conference statement, things like a gaps analysis, trying to connect across different scales, and then working with some of these themes that the other working groups have already mentioned. And before I close out, I just wanted to acknowledge that as a participant in this, it was a real pleasure to be at the Arctic Observing Summit and to offer a really sincere thank you to all of the chairs and organizing committee and everyone that put a ton of work into making this happen. So just appreciating that, and I will pass it to Sandy. I believe you are closing us out.
I am. Thanks for that recap, Hazel. And I I share your thanks. It was really a wonderful meeting, and a lot of people on this call put a lot of effort into making it happen. Before I start my remarks, I also wanted to acknowledge, which I meant to do at the beginning of the meeting, that we invited members of the USAON board, the federal only board, to join this call. And I'm very happy to see that we have, I think, 5 or 6 different members of the USAON board here. And so as we're describing some of these more actionable things, we do have a great audience for hearing where these proposed efforts maybe could go forward. So with the capacity sharing working group, it was the first time we had a capacity sharing working group theme specifically at the Arctic Observing Summit, which is not to say it's the first time we talked about capacity at the summit. In particular, the food security working group from the 2020 summit had a lot of dialogue around capacity, to the extent where actions that were also happening through the Arctic Science Ministerial, kind of drawing capacity into its own topic. It was in the Science Ministerial context, it was called strengthening. The organizers wanted to have this as a specific standalone focus. There was also a simultaneous recognition that it's extremely cross-cutting and could potentially lead to conflicts if we had it as a standalone theme and people had to choose between either, being in a working group about food security or data and one about capacity. So we only met as a cross-cutting working group. And so you've pretty much heard a lot of the cross-cutting conversations that came out of this topic and the diversity of it. And so I want to acknowledge this group was really kind of broadly led. We didn't really ever come up with kind of a very strict structure. But Lisa Grossfield with the Arctic Passion Project helped co-lead this. We partnered with the organization Ikarvik, which is a Canadian Inuit-led organization. The word Ikarvik means bridge. And that was a really important concept. So Justin, Shelley, and Eric from Ikarvik provided a lot of guidance to our discussions. Louise Mercer was our early career participant. Ani Kroger, Olivia Lee, who's on this call, also helped convene and organize our discussions, as did Jay Perlman. And so what we really recognized, even amongst the small group of people trying to pull this topic together, was that we wanted to really focus on what people even thought capacity meant as a starting point, because we suspected from our early conversations with other working group chairs that there was a lot of diversity in perspectives on this. And initially the theme had been capacity building. The working group was capacity building, but we really quickly shifted over to this emphasis on capacity sharing and recognizing, in particular, between more Western concepts of capacity that often relate to opportunities for early career researchers or different kinds of trainings that need to happen. We heard the word trainings come up, with the data presentation, and also with working group 1 in terms of the kind of capacities Western researchers need to develop for themselves to be well trained to go into the field and interact with communities. That's sort of one set of considerations. But from the standpoint of, in particular, food security, the food security working group and a lot of the Indigenous participants at the summit, there's a really strong sense that and recognized sense that the communities themselves have many strengths to bring to the table. They have a lot of capacity to do a lot of this work. And how do we better bridge between capacities and not view it as a one-way street? There was a lot of dialogue about upfront funding for relationship building, and the work the preparatory work that needs to happen before proposals even move forward or go into the field. Some specific recommendations, because it was an early working group, and because, you know, we were kind of just even working at this definitional level, the leading recommendation was that this should be an ongoing conversation at the summits, that we need to sort of build on what we've discussed already. In general, I think a wide recommendation from our group and from other groups at the summit was a lot of these groups need to work intersessionally and not only work at the summit. And we need to find ways to, some groups already do this. The Food Security Working Group already does this. The Data Working Group already does this. How can we get some of these other groups maybe operating under a framework like SAON so that they can continue to move conversations forward between summits? Was an important topic that came up in our group and other groups as well. And so, you know, I think you heard a lot of the other types of conversations that we had under capacity sharing. I will say that there was a particularly nice closing session where there was a sort of modeled aspect of how capacity sharing could move forward, where Lisa as an early career researcher and Justin Milton as an Arctic youth kind of co-led the closing session for our group, and really recognizing that early career researchers and Arctic youth are a great building point for doing this work better, because they're at the beginning of their career. They have some opportunities to do this networking and relationship building. So I will just end there, and now we can invite, I'm sorry, I was just catching up on a chat. So now we can invite questions and conversation on the second set of presentations. And, you know, we gave ourselves some extra time for this meeting to have broader ranging conversations, so we can also loop in the presenters from the first session. So any questions? Let's start with questions for the second round of presentations, and then we'll turn to the broader discussion.
I've got a question for Alice, picking up on something that Sandy just said. So not to be completely discouraging here, but one of your closing points was that by the time we get to the next summit in 2 years, we will have 1 to 2 SAVs ready for general feedback. That's very discouraging. I mean, the pace just seems, the ice is melting faster than the pace of that progress. So are you planning to work intersessionally, as Sandy has suggested? I mean, how do you see moving that process a little faster? Or am I just being completely unreasonable and that's perfectly fast?
I certainly share your sense that things move slowly, but the conclusions that came out of the discussions that we were having at the summit is that the time it takes to get experts in 12 different fields and with a whole bunch of different backgrounds to agree on something is perhaps glacial. And the value in shared Arctic variables, as we see it, is really in bringing groups together to have those conversations. So the plan, in order to get a couple of proposals through to feedback stage by the next summit, is really relying on Arctic Passion and RNA co-ops to move those forward. At this point, I think that is a feasible, but I think that is a realistic timeline. I think trying to move it faster than that, and we're going to be too beholden to a timeline to actually do it right and get the people, get the feedback, get the involvement that we need to make a really meaningfully inclusive process.
If I could just add to that a little bit, just for context. So one thing that I think SAON has tried to emphasize about shared Arctic variables is we're not trying to recreate every variable in the universe. We're really trying to focus on those variables where this shared approach is going to have a huge additive value. And the essential variables of the global networks have also proceeded really slowly. And many of them are still not defined, a decade after they were identified. When Seon set out this process, we said, even if we identified 6 of these that we worked on over the course of, something like a 4 to 6 year period, that would feel like success. The Arctic Passion Project is funded to work on 2 to 4 of these, and they have a 4-year funding cycle. And so they have to complete their work, and they're 1 year into their project. So these things will move forward, but as Alice said, to get a truly inclusive process is going to move at a pace where we have to be patient and sort of scale our expectations accordingly. But hopefully the strength of what we accomplish speaks for itself at the end of the day. And maybe Hayo, were you going to speak to this as well, or? Okay, I'll turn it over to Hayo, and then if you want to respond to anything after.
Yeah, I just want to, you put it really well, Sandy, so all I can do is amplify your points, but I did want to add a data point specifically, which was great to have strong engagement by GOOS, the Global Ocean Observing System, at the meeting, including the GOOS Steering Committee Chair, Tosta Tanwa. So in talking with him, GOOS provides an interesting data point. For their essential ocean variables process, as I understand it from talking to him about this very issue, took 3 years. And from setting up a group or identifying a group of people that would work on the essential ocean variables to getting to a first draft of the variables. And these groups were fairly homogeneous, so they did not involve outside rights holders or stakeholders, but rather they focused on services such as maritime services and others to kind of provide the perspective of others outside of the process. And he felt they're actually going to go through now a review, because what they found was that even under those circumstances, some of the variables just did not capture main concerns from a perspective of ocean planning, mariculture, what have you. And so I actually feel, I mean, maybe this it's up for others to decide whether this community as a whole has been successful. But my sense is that in general, in particular, given the lack of resources for some of the indigenous participants in particular, we're doing reasonably well, and it is going to be critical to have strong engagement, as Craig pointed out earlier, from groups such as, if the variables relate to, say, salmon, as what Craig was laying out, from fish management groups or councils, so that you capture the entire breadth and depth of the problem right from the start. But in general, I'm actually quite encouraged by where we're at now. Thanks.
This is Brian Melson, US EPA.
Yes, go ahead, Brian.
U.S. Environmental Protection Agency spent more than millions of dollars in 10 years with a national program, Environmental Monitoring and Assessment Program, which include the great rivers, wetlands, terrestrial, open ocean, and coastal areas of the United States. And we periodically now publish coastal condition reports, which include discussions about what variables or parameters or metrics or whatever you want to call it, define the term. And we, during that process, within EPA, but also I think within NOAA, when they did their National Status and Trends program, some of you may remember when they used Mussel Watch, things like that. We had different types of workshops to vet those variables or parameters or core measurements. And without going into too much detail, and you could do this no matter what the environments, you may come up with a list of core variables that are based on science and are legally and scientifically defendable, which is important for EPA because of the Clean Water Act and what we do. But at the same time, or concurrently, or separately, you have research variables that you're trying to codify and see in the future they would be of use to that monitoring program. So that allows an evolution to occur over time. And lastly, I've been looking back at some of our historical documents that were used to develop the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System enterprise with 11 regional associations. And I think I'll share that with the board, Arctic Observing Network board. In fact, one of the first documents that came out 2001 was just on this document, like what are we going to measure and why we are going to measure. And it's evolved over time to such an extent, the Interagency Ocean Observation Committee, of what I represent EPA on, is about ready to complete its marine mammals distribution and abundance recommendations for EOVs to be used possibly locally, but regionally or worldwide. And it's based on information that we gathered from throughout the world. So hopefully we will provide some information to be of use. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. And I'll mention that Brian is newly representing EPA on the USA on board, taking over from Suzanne Van Drunik, and we're really looking forward to Brian's contributions. Hayo, your hand is up again, or still, or okay. Any other questions? I think we can open up into the broader discussion. Questions for the group, or did you see some synergistic opportunities, or want to talk about some of these fundable opportunities a little bit more? Christina, and then we'll hear from Hayo.
Thank you. If nobody else has a question, I can pose a question from my working group to the broader group here. And the question is, what challenges are other projects or working groups experiencing when it comes to data interoperability? Is it problems with lack of access, secured connections, or lack of training for researchers? Or on the opposite side, if there isn't any issues, what are their data flows and what strategies do they use to ensure data interoperability? Any thoughts or discussion on that, that would be appreciated.
I would offer a point that actually came up at our last board meeting, and that I think is also something that it looks like maybe Bill Manley's left the call, but Allison Gaylord is still here, that there's often a question posed about what are the observing assets? What do we consider part of the Arctic Observing Network? And the kind of that, it sort of relates to your findability question. How do we find who's doing what? And tools like the Arctic Observing Viewer have been really helpful for that. But as I think Bill Manley's illustrated, there's even interoperability issues around, translating between maybe one agency's way of representing their observing systems and another agency's, let alone, scaling from communities up to satellites or internationally. And so, Allison, not to put you on the spot, but maybe you want to say a few words about that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Yeah, we've taken a step back through the SAN Polar Observing Assets Working Group to look at those definitions and vet them more broadly through the community. And actually tomorrow morning, we have a conversation at 8 a.m. Alaska time, and then again next Thursday about this very topic. I think we're really narrowing down on those definitions, and I'd like to see them pushed forward to the broader community pretty soon. I'll go ahead and just put a link to the website if anybody would like to join that conversation. But thank you for bringing this up. Anything else?
No, that's great. Does anyone else want to respond to Christina's question?
Thank you, Sandy and Allison.
And Hayo, I saw you had put your hand up again. Was there something you wanted to pose?
Well, yeah, I had a question, and part of it was because there was a bit of a pause there. But I mean, my question is maybe even somewhat related to what Christina was asking. And this is a question both for the data experts here in this meeting and others. And that is whether there's any mechanisms to preserve some of the context when searching for shared Arctic variables, right? Or discoverability of shared Arctic variables, in the sense that, if you go to the federated search tool, I just did that, for Polder, there really is no context, right? Everything is just listed based on whatever your search criteria are. But what I feel as being important is finding a way so that, in particular, outside users or others who are not necessarily familiar with the broader Arctic data landscape and observing landscape would get some additional guidance and would know that a particular variable has been developed as part of a suite of shared Arctic variables, and as a result has been through a broader consensus and kind of scrutinizing vetting process, and at the same time may be part of a suite of actual metrics or observables that come under the broader umbrella of a theme, whether it's wildfire or salmon or fisheries. That was what discussed at the summit. So are there ways to achieve that? And if so, how? And is there any additional information that those who are actually working on shared Arctic variables or on the expert panels need to be aware of?
I think I can try to answer that, but I'm not sure I'm really tracking the conversation very well, just because of, I'm at the end of my long work day, so for personal reasons, not because of anything you guys are doing. I think it's recognized already that the search and discovery tools are not necessarily designed for the kinds of users that you're interested in with your question. So there needs to be a fundamental redesign, rebuilding of the search tools, and also perhaps some of the catalog information that's being used to enable discovery. And so, yeah, if you have a theme, for example, you want to add a theme to this the search catalog, that might help. And the way we do that now is with tags. That's simple enough, but that still might not be sufficient for the reason you stated, because you have to know about the theme before you can search based on it. So yeah, it's kind of a big problem. I don't know that I have a good solution. There is a group of data-oriented people working with the Earth Science Information Partners who are trying to address this problem through a new paradigm called usage-based discovery. But that's really kind of a cutting-edge kind of application. We're also going to host a workshop in the summer on knowledge graph federation, but that's very technical, having to do with how do you span information across a variety of domains so that there's a crosswalk. But these are cutting edge topics. I don't have a good solution for this.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think those were some really interesting points and I think speak to where we could go in the future with some of these issues. I know we're at the end of our time. Alice has her hand up, maybe because she was going to help with a wrap up and let us know the status on the conference statement. And so maybe I'll just turn it over to you, Alice, for the wrap up.
Yes, that was exactly what I was going to do. So the Arctic Observing Summit conference statement will be out for review in public at the beginning of May. So we're just kind of wrapping it up now. And then over the summer, we'll be publishing the more complete reports out from all of the different working groups. So the more kind of session level details of what was discussed at Summit. So keep an eye out in the next month if you want, the 5-page or less version. Keep an eye out over the summer if you can't get enough Arctic Observing Summit.
Who can? Thanks so much. Thanks to all the speakers. We really value your time and thanks to the USA on Board for lending us your ear and hopefully this will lead to some great discussions moving forward. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.